Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Today, our guest is Journal of the American Revolution contributor Jeff Haroff, and he'll be discussing about espionage activities around Fort Detroit. Really compelling. Jeff, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
So, Jeff, you're a first time guest. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, unlike some of your other guests, I don't really have a degree in history. I have a degree in chemistry and biology, and I'm actually a health and safety environment manager. However, with that said, though, I've always had like a lifelong interest in history, especially American history. And when I began to earn enough money, I became a living historian. And the first group that I joined was a group that portrayed a French militia company in Detroit during the Revolutionary War. So, based upon that, I did start doing a lot of research, and my research led to a lot of information that eventually led into the article that you're all going to be publishing.
Excellent. So, Jeff, if you could tell us maybe what made you want to write about this topic, particularly Fort Detroit in the Revolution.
Yeah, I've always had an interest in revolutionary Detroit, and this is kind of a unique topic. It's not so much military and what units went where and such, but it has a little bit of an underlining interest in that espionage and spies and things like that kind of give a different twist on the history of the battles and how things came to be and such.
Yeah. So, Jeff, for those who don't know, because a lot of folks maybe have an Eastern orientation about the Revolution. Why was Fort Detroit so important in the war? How would you summarize that?
Well, yeah, ever since the fort was founded by Cadillac in 1701, it served as a major depot for the French at the time until 1761 as a fur trade center, so that the furs going to Europe passed through the area, which was a very lucrative enterprise for the French. And then when the British took over, it remained so. Now, when the Revolutionary War started, the positioning of the fort was far enough away from the American forces in New York and Western Virginia, so it wasn't under immediate threat. The British military at that time had established Detroit as a major depot for relations with their Native American allies and getting supplies to and from the Detroit. They took advantage of the Great Lakes water system so they could quickly move materials with their larger canoes, but more importantly, with their sailing ships. So when it came time to provide the enhancements for the British Native Americans, it was easy for them to do, and also allowed the movement of military troops down to Lake Erie, shortening their travel time into Ohio and Kentucky.
Yeah, Jeff, you write something very interesting in your article. It's that even though the French and Indian War is over and the French have been repulsed from the area, Detroit is still a really mixed community. Native peoples, French peoples, obviously now British peoples. Talk about kind of that dynamic. You talk especially about a group called the Habitants. Tell us about them.
Right, so the habitants is just what the French called themselves, which means inhabitants. So during the Seven Years' War, or the French Indian War as it's known in the United States, the French had, like I mentioned, occupied Detroit, and with the capture of Detroit by the British, the French still occupied the area, and it was a very strong French presence. The British came in smaller numbers at first, and then the Native Americans, of course, were living in the area, such as the Odawa, the Ojibwe, the Padawan, and those habitants had a really good relationship with those Native Americans. So now the French, when they viewed the war as it was starting to happen, they pretty much considered that a British Civil War, and they really didn't want to become too involved in that because it was British, and they were trying to keep their culture as French Canadians or as habitants. And in fact, there's a couple of comments made by the British commanders. Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton is one of them, that he kind of criticizes the French in that they're not like the British. They're mostly farmers who just grow enough to subsist and carry on their lives with any promise or any effort to expand upon their well being or their fortunes. But that was the way the habitants figured life should be, right? They engaged in farming when necessary to support themselves. They were engaged in the fur trade, which made that connection with the Native Americans very strong. And when the habitants looked at the British, they were seen as outsiders. They didn't understand their customs. They still had the antagonism between the war. 1763, there's the Pontiac Rebellion, where the British forces are basically attacked by the Native Americans, and 9 of the forts in the Great Lakes regions are captured by the Native Americans. And Detroit's put under siege, and the British always looked at that, and the French Canadians, the habitants, didn't really support the British as much as the British thought they should. So there's still that antagonism between the British looking at the habitants with equal habitants looking at the British at the same type of degree of suspicion and indifference, basically.
Now, Jeff, the heart of your article is about spying. Maybe talk about the decision to begin spying on Fort Detroit. Where did that come from?
Yeah, not unsurprising. There's really not a whole lot written in the papers I went through. So there's the George Rogers Clark papers that was printed by the Illinois State Historical Society. And then for the British, there's going to be the Hallemand papers published in the Michigan Pioneer Historical Collection. So, as you can guess, they really don't write a whole lot about spying and their spies and espionage when they communicate, because that was considered something that was improper to do, and spies are hung. So, I think there was a suppression of written information at least. But I can tell you that when George Rogers Clark assumed control of the Virginia State Forces in 1778, things seemed to pick up a little bit more. For example, Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton starts writing about that. He's concerned that he couldn't think of more than 1 to 20 French Canadians or habitants whose oath of allegiance would force them to support the British cause in Detroit. So that kind of gives us an idea that things are not going really well for the British and their relationship with the habitants. And even as late as 1782, Major De Peyster, who supersedes Hamilton when Hamilton's captured at Vincennes in 1779, he even continues that some of the Canadians that he captured are being sent out east to Fort Niagara or Carleton Island because they cannot be trusted and they were dangerous in Detroit. So there are some spies going on with the French. The Rogers even writes that in '79 that there's a great number of French traders among the Native Americans who express interest in supporting the cause with the Americans down in the Illinois country. And then the British, of course, kind of got wind of this, and there was a continuing references and concerns about what the French were doing and how they were spying, and perhaps maybe they weren't as loyal as Hamilton mentioned to the British cause as they should be.
Jeff, let's talk about, I guess, the mechanics of this. Who were the primary spies at Fort Detroit, and how would they operate? Right, we don't have secret gadgets yet in spying, so what does a spy do in the 18th century?
Right. So there were some British spies that were operating in Detroit for the Americans. The Hamilton also talks about the unnamed traitors who were related and supported the rebels in their hearts right before he left for Fort Vincennes in 1777. The Lieutenant Governor Hamilton also reaches out to Lieutenant Governor Cambron, who was in basically the responsibility of the province of Quebec, that he says that the disposition of the British people requires something more than a shadow of authority to keep them bound to duty. So what would they would often do is the spies would work with the lower ranks British to get as much information as they possibly could. So there was a report that one spy named Botswick, he was accused of toasting to the American crown or to the American Congress in a tavern, and then his partner that's with him, he's kind of pushing the soldiers that they're talking to kind of give them some little bit more information about Colonel Butler and his Rangers. So that kind of gives us an idea of what's going on and how they're trying to get the information. They're most likely meeting soldiers in the tavern or areas where they're feeling more relaxed, and the soldiers are more likely to talk. And the American spies are probing and pressing and maybe buying maybe something to drink or such like that. Try to get those soldiers to open up and reveal the secrets.
Jeff, do we know, at least maybe from your research, what did these spies uncover? Did you ever see anything in your notes that where you actually saw the intelligence saved?
Yeah, once again, there's not a whole lot written there. Um, George Rogers Clark does mention that he's getting information in 1780 and 1782 about upcoming Native American raids. In particular, he calls out in 1782 Colonel Caldwell's raid down into in Kentucky. The spies knew and reported that the British and their allies were starting to prepare for raids, but there was no evidence that they knew exactly where they were going to attack and what areas they were moving into. We do know that afterwards in 1782, Caldwell attacks Bryant Station and it's unsuccessful in capturing that area. So there's really no clear evidence that the Kentuckians were warned ahead of time that was coming. It was just a matter of military activity that prevented the British from conquering that area.
Yeah. So let's talk about the British a little bit. Um, they probably know there's spies around. They have their own spies. How do they combat espionage? What's their counter espionage tactics that you found?
So the major thing it appears that what they're doing is that if they suspect someone of being a spy, they are putting them on a ship and shipping them out to Fort Niagara or Carleton. So, as both Lieutenant Governor Hamilton and Major DePeester mentioned, that they're sending the suspected spies, or even those who may not be spies but support the American cause, they're being sent out east. So they're away from the area and they can't really cause any troubles in Detroit. Because the other line thing is also that there are, in the Illinois countries, there's Fort Vincennes and Cayuga and those areas down there where the Americans have captured earlier in the war, that there's a lot of communication evidently going on between the French in Detroit and the French in those areas. They're often related by blood or by partnership. So again, the British are trying to get whoever they suspect out of the area so they're no longer posing as a threat. There's an interesting case that there's Americans prisoners that are being brought up to Detroit from the raids into Kentucky, and it appears that two individuals, John Edgar and Israel Putnam, are working with these American prisoners, and they're trying to get the prisoners to get out of Detroit, move down to Miami town, where presumably they can be escorted back into Kentucky by some perhaps Native Americans or traders that can get them out of the area and back into Kentucky. And there's a trial that three of the American prisoners are captured, and each of them mentions that the Edgar, especially, is working with the Americans. He's providing these prisoners with food and ammunition. And when the British bring back these prisoners, they're tried in front of a justice of peace in Detroit. And as soon as the trial is over, there's a letter going out east saying that they're moving John Edgar out to Carleton and because he's a traitor, and they're searching for the other American, Israel and Putnam. However, Putnam escapes down into Kentucky, but Edgar moves out to Carlton, and then he just disappears from all records after that. So I could never find out exactly what happened to Edgar, but I guess you can always let your imagination go and create stories in your mind, but there's really no documentation to give 100% proof.
Yeah. So Jeff, if we could, let's talk about your analysis here a little bit. Um, both sides will have spies. Both sides, have objectives. Do you feel one side or the other was better at spying than their opponents?
I think maybe the Americans were little bit more situated in a better position because they did have the British who, who favored the American cause, and they did have the French who had a dislike for for the British and favored the American cause. Now, one thing interesting about the French is they spoke French, and it was a very tight community. So a lot of times there is no record of any Frenchmen from Detroit being turned over by the British. So I think they ran a pretty good, successful spy operation as much as possible. In fact, when uh, George Roger Clark captures Fort Vincennes in 1779, there's a lot of volunteers from Detroit, and Rogers doesn't have enough men to guard them there at Vincennes. So Rogers comes up with the solution is that he's going to release all the volunteers to back to Detroit with an oath of neutrality. And then Rogers makes the comment that a lot of the volunteers go off heading towards Detroit, huzzaing the Congress and George Rogers Clark's army, and promising that they're going to support Clark as spies. So I think the spy operation, for the Americans at least, is pretty strong in Detroit. For the British, on the other hand, they don't really write that much about spies. Most likely, they're relying upon their Native Americans to absorb what's going on in Kentucky, in southern Ohio, and they're bringing back reports. And once in a while, you'll see reports from rangers like Butler's Rangers saying that they're gaining information that the Americans are building a fort, for example, at the Falls of the Ohio, which is now called Louisville. So that's kind of the spies they use, and I think it would be kind of hard for the British to infiltrate the American community because it's smaller and it's tighter knit, and maybe a British spy would be more obvious, perhaps.
So Jeff, we always end with the same question on our show. It gets to the heart of what we do here, I think. How do you believe this article helps us understand the Revolutionary Era better?
I think, rightly so, there's a lot of attention placed upon the Eastern Theater and what's going on in the former colonies. However, there is a lot more going on in the West, too, right? We have a British presence in the Great Lakes that's combating efforts by the Americans to move into Kentucky and Ohio. And there's a spy operation going on, and even along the Illinois area settlements in the Mississippi River region. There's a lot of different things going on that are sometimes not purposely overlooked, but are overlooked. But in reality, when the peace comes, and in 1786 or 1796, I'm sorry, and the British actually take control of the Great Lakes, there's an interesting dynamic in that the French are actually welcoming the Americans and saying goodbye to the British. And, there was no love lost there. And I kind of believe that maybe the presence of the Americans during the war gave hope to the French that maybe that some things might be improving with the British and their control of the fur trade and their oppressive policies towards the French of Detroit would go away. So I think that's just an interesting aspect of all the relationships and how the different ethnic groups interact in the area.
Wonderful. Well, Jeff Haroff, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much.